It's, my intent is not to try to convince you of anything that I believe, but just to say how it affects myself,
Hmm.
and maybe someone that that is a person of faith. And so I grew up in quite a traditional Christian home in the Detroit area. And somehow I was just up there last week, unfortunately, for a funeral. But one of my mom's cousins told me that my mom, when I was less than five, told me about a report from one of my teachers who said, Bob only draws pictures and writes about the ocean, not writes at five. But so I was drawing pictures of myself underwater at the age of five, somehow from Detroit.
That's
So
fantastic.
I ended up at University of Miami and ended up really living the dream of what a lot of marine conservationists want to do, which is coral reef ecology. So I was scuba diving on coral reefs in the Florida Keys and Bahamas for my PhD. But then part of my faith tradition was also to be involved in service, particularly thinking about being in service in places of the world where there's at least perceived spiritual need and also physical needs. And so my wife and I, was a professional musician at the time, and we decided to join a team that was working on developing a marine laboratory in a place called the Republic of Maldives, which is a coral reef island country south of India. And we ended up between there and India for about 10 years. And
Wow.
during my time in Miami, my faith really was my faith and my science was my science. There was just really no intersection whatsoever. And then this appeared to be an opportunity to use the science in order to engage with faith issues, but also
Mhm.
do something important. Nobody had really studied what I was studying in the Maldives, so it's a beautiful
Yeah, it's
place.
unique. That's
Yeah, and India. We did some of the first coral reef surveys on the west coast of India. But at
wow.
that time, still the science was kind of a means to an end with the faith. There was still not much interaction. Then we decided to move to England and began working on with some church things there. But also, I joined then this as a volunteer this organization called Rocha, which is spelled A and then Rocha. It means the rock in Portuguese. And there had I would call an epiphany of really seeing how the faith and the science went together, and that actually the Christian faith offers a really strong platform out of which to really care for the world. I saw my conservation in a very different light. I saw it now as part of my faith. So for me, it was really a joining of those two worlds. It was like these two
Mhm.
worlds didn't overlap, then they began to overlap a little bit in a Venn diagram, and then they became completely ensconced together. And if there's loads of resources, I'm not going to talk about specifics, but if you are interested in books on or resources on particularly the Christian faith and conservation, I'd be happy to connect with you on that.
Yeah, that'd be
Um,
wonderful.
so we lived in England for about 11 years, loved it. There's not such a dichotomy between science and faith. They've been integrated for a very long time, so it's much easier to kind of think holistically. But we felt that it was important to try to come back to the U.S. We had gone about 21 years. Our kids were getting into high school, and we just thought, let's come back. So I've been in the Titusville, kind of east of Orlando area near the Kennedy Space Center for about the last 7 years, and really trying to implement kind of a holistic conservation, really of the whole watershed. So I focus on marine conservation, particularly in the Indian River Lagoon, a big estuary, and also at the National Seashore. Canaveral National Seashore is part of the National Park System, and I have research permits to work out there. But we really start in Orlando and think about it as a whole watershed
Hmm.
and movement through the system. But so with that background personally, let me just talk a little bit for just quickly about Arasha.
Yeah, please
Um,
do.
Let me share my screen. Um,
In Titusville, I've heard there's a bunch of restoration efforts, either planned or ongoing, for the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge.
Yes, yeah, and it's exciting. We're involved in a number of those.
Oh, okay.
So this is our organization. If you're interested in sort of the website, that's the international website. I'll show you the US one. So we're a consortium really of organizations that are guided by five principles or values. That we're Christian, so we try to work out of our faith. We're involved in science-based conservation, so we're doing the science, but also using science to be able to do conservation. We work in cooperation. So this is where, for example, in the Indian River Lagoon, we're partnering with the Brevard Zoo.
Hmm.
We volunteer. University of Central Florida is doing mangrove restoration. We're connected in with the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge and the Canaveral National Seashore. So we very much feel we want to cooperate with anybody that wants to work with us. And we're focused on communities as well. So it's not just habitats and species, but also the people that are a part of this and working in and through. And in most of our places we work around the world, it's Kenyans who live in Kenya in that city working in Kenya. It's Portuguese people in Portugal, and so they're part of the local community. And we value cross-cultural views, so we're trying to be open to other ways of thinking.
And
And
it's
you can
not just marine, right? Ecosystems.
correct.
You work in pretty much all different types of ecoregions across the world.
Exactly. You can see the blue countries where we work. So, for example, in India right now, they're doing a major tiger survey in a forest
Wow.
in the middle of India.
Wow.
In South Africa, we're working on a turtle species that's endangered, land turtle. In New Zealand, we work on seabirds. In Canada, they're working on oysters and restoring a river watershed. Our Canadian project might be one of the ones that's most interesting. And one of the other things that's different about our organization, in many of the locations, there's a physical center where you could go and stay and volunteer and be a part of it. So, for
Oh,
example, in
wow.
Canada, we own some land. There's a center there where you can come and rent a room for a week or months and participate in the conservation work, and then the life
Wow.
kind of living in community as well. Our house kind of functions as that here in Florida right now,
That's great.
where if you came here and wanted to help, you'd probably stay upstairs and then we'd eat meals together and go out and do the work together. So we're quite a global organization. And as Josh said, it's not just marine. In fact, it's mostly terrestrial ecology, and in a number of places we are working in freshwater riverine systems as well. So, but for our marine work, we focus on kind of four different aspects: biodiversity and beauty. So think about habitat and species conservation. This is where restoration would come under as well.
Mhm.
We do a lot of work in trying to reduce plastic pollution and also doing research on microplastics. We do deal with food security, human health, well-being, some of the blue mind ideas, if you're familiar with that, the benefits of water for mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health, but also in places where we work, sometimes livelihoods as well. And then we also focus on climate change.
Sure.
So here's one species in Kenya, a guitarfish, that's critically endangered on a IUCN red list that we have a project that's working to protect.
Hmm.
Here's some of our partnership in the Indian River Lagoon. This is oyster reef restoration.
Oh,
These kind of gabions, many of you will be familiar with this type of work. So we're doing coral reef restoration in Kenya, doing coral gardening, for example. Here, this is a nurdle, the basis of plastic pollution sort of chain and plastic production. So we do research and we're involved in the Great Global Nurdle Hunt, if you're interested in that. We do livelihood. So these are Kenyan fishermen that I'm kind of standing with, and we are concerned with the guitar fish, but also concerned with these guys and their lives
sure.
and trying to connect with them. We also have a big focus on young scientists. So these are all young, two of them with PhDs and another one studying. We were this rough life. We had to go to Monaco and the south of France and wander the beaches looking for plastic pollution between amazing meals. But part of it is training young scientists to be able to do research and also be able to think about their faith in the science. What does it mean? They might have been trained in scientific principles, but then they're trying to grapple with, maybe a traditional faith background that didn't talk about the environment. So that's a big part of what we do, is working with young scientists as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is some of our climate change work. For example, we monitor coral reefs in Kenya and trying to respond to coral bleaching events. We do international things. So we're involved in the World Conservation Congresses. Here I spoke at the UN Oceans Conference. It's a deceptive picture. It's like 3 people in the audience, everyone's tuned out, but it looks good to be at the UN. But we do represent sort of faith actors on the big international stage at the climate COPs and the biodiversity COPs and things like that. And a lot of it's just an excuse to get underwater and scuba dive and have fun. So you can see a little bit more about our work in Florida at this particular web address, and then I'll give some links in the chat in a minute. But yeah, I'll stop my share. And I know you had some questions, or maybe that brings up some questions that you have. But
Yeah,
that's a little bit about me, a little bit about our organization,
that's great.
the range of things that we participate in.
I do have some questions that I prepared, but I'll go ahead and open it up to everyone else and see if anyone else has any burning questions. One of the questions I had were that jumped out at me. So there's obviously a lot of nonprofit environmental activists, stewardship, conservation groups out there. What do you think that because Rocha approaches it from a Christian or a spiritual perspective, how do you think that makes you guys different than like somebody that would be approaching this from like a secular perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. You go out and you do a transect and a quadrat, and there's not a Christian transect.
Right. Exactly.
So in many ways, the science is directed by scientific principles. So I think what I've found is that for many people, their faith is an important part of their life, and also their love of nature, love of the environment, their being outside, whatever is really important part of their life. And often people are asked to prioritize and to choose. And if the faith communities are not saying that conservation is important, that the environment is important, that it's an important part of the Christian life, I've met too many young people who either left their faith because they perceived it to be antithetical to environmental conservation, or just as tragic, they've decided, well, a career in the environment is not for me because it doesn't have any, it's not really that important. So I do think it's about wholeness and healing of people and helping them to see how these things go together. I do think too that the Christian faith, and it's not unique necessarily to the Christian faith, but that's my background, so I know it, brings particular principles that will help us to embed conservation in a very deep way, and sort of perhaps when there's a choice to be made that's very hard, if the conservation principles are resonant with your faith, it maybe makes it easier to make those hard choices. One example in the Christian faith is like loving your neighbor. And we talk about this with plastic pollution. If you're producing plastic pollution and it ends up in the ocean, it's being transferred by a current to a different place. It's really not loving your neighbor. And there's lots of reasons not to do plastic pollution and not to pollute, but I think these principles, when they resonate with deep values, can often strengthen those activities
Absolutely.
and behaviors. And even just a practical example, for example, our group in the UK, I don't remember the exact percentage, but something like 7% of the land in the UK is owned by the church.
Wow.
And here in the US, I know even in the town I grew up in, 1/36 of the city is owned by the Catholic Church. So there's a significant footprint both in terms of energy, in terms of land, from faith communities that is really important, I think, for conservation. In our church in the UK, the graveyard had been there for 800 years, and there were species there that aren't anywhere else, just because it hasn't been touched. Certain lichens and certain creatures because of that. The intention wasn't conservation, but it's
Right,
a
right,
byproduct. Yeah.
right.
So.
Well, and in Genesis, we're told as Christians to be good stewards and of the natural resources that we've been given by God. And
Yeah.
and for me, another aspect, at least from our perspective, like more ecological restoration, is there's so many overlaps between what we do and like the restorative nature of Christianity, and how
Yeah.
you take something that's been broken and you restore it to make something new.
Yes.
And so I've always appreciated those additional analogies between the world and
Yeah.
what we work in the Christian faith.
Yes, exactly.
So
Yeah.
you mentioned a little bit working with like commercial fishermen in Kenya, was it?
Yeah. Yes.
So I guess how, and from an Arash perspective, how do you guys balance that between like conservation efforts and like economic development? Because obviously both are important. So
Yeah.
where do you guys fall in that?
Sure. Yeah, and it's obviously on a case by case basis,
Sure.
but I think in the conservation world, at least with biodiversity conservation, so our mandate is biodiversity conservation, and humans are also biodiversity. And so I think that there's very much take a place like Kenya, the national parks were made, excluded people. It was really biodiversity's sake, and people suffered. And that really has shown to be a difficult
Sure.
way to do things, and doesn't ultimately work in the end. So I think that people are a part of both the problem and the solution. And so I think in our case, what we're trying to do is look at the science and say, identify, there may be human economic greed, or that is causing problems that may need to stop, and it's not always able to maximize both economic benefit and biodiversity conservation. But then I think there's, particularly again from a Christian, but not only from a Christian perspective, but from a Christian perspective, there's a real emphasis in the Christian teachings on caring for the poor. So I do think that particularly, like say in Kenya, these are artisanal fishermen. They're going out in dugout canoes, or they're
Right.
going out to try to get their daily fish. And so we must care for and help offset, if we're asking them not to catch those sharks, how are we helping them to make the resources that they need? In the case of like here in Florida, there may be ways, like for example, the space center is we think is beginning to cause some major problems, and the Port of Canaveral, now the largest cruise port in the world, how do we help constrain some of that damaging economic growth, versus, because it's what that pollution in the lagoon, it maybe it's affecting some recreational fishers who could fish somewhere else, but there's also a large population, particularly of people of color, who fish on the lagoon for food
Their
and
sustenance, right?
their
Yeah.
sustenance. And so, really trying to be a voice for that, to try to
For those people that might
yeah,
not have a voice in those
exactly.
conversations, yeah.
Yeah. So it's very much a part of the equation, but I think that um, we work in cooperation both with secular and Christian groups, and within Christian. So with secular groups, we're working hard to try to develop good ways of maintaining economic growth while preserving biodiversity. But then within a Christian community, much of the focus is on humans and prioritizing humans over other species. So our voice is sort of a one calling in the wilderness. That actually that guitar fish is really important to God,
Right.
and we can't and so we're sort of been the voice of the non-human species within the Christian community, because much of, may be surprising, but globally the Christian community has, especially outside of the US, has taken on the environment as a really important aspect, particularly climate change, but it's almost all been focused on the impact on humans. And so what we're
Right.
trying to do is bring in, yes, but there's millions of other species that are just as important and need.
The
Um,
guitar fish, was it overfishing that was threatening that species?
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's kind of a meandering
Interesting.
answer, but
No, and it's you said something that really piqued my interest, where you talk about how, like, a lot of environmental conservation efforts are about removing the human interaction with those environments, and
yeah,
when in reality we're part of the environment, and
yeah,
so by removing us is not always the answer. It's not always the most sustainable thing either. It's
yeah,
just more about finding that balance,
yeah,
because I mean, everybody knows we can be incredibly destructive as a species, but
yes,
we can also get to a point where we are living more in harmony than
yes,
would be otherwise.
that's right. That's right.
Well, what are some specific initiatives that you, Bob, are working on right now?
Yeah, so locally here in Florida, we are trying to really understand and work in partnership with Canaveral National Seashore.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful area of beachfront property that's just north of NASA. So with the NASA Kennedy Space Center, there's a whole big area that's been protected. So trying to understand the ecology of the sandy beaches, looking at that impacts like microplastics, and trying to look at species that aren't necessarily on everyone's radar.
Right.
And then we're also working sort of in the Indian River Lagoon. We have
Hmm.
a partnership. There's a university in Daytona Beach called Bethune-Cookman, and one of our
Hmm.
former interns is doing his master's degree there, studying pipefish and seahorses. And so we're trying to look at the diversity of those creatures in the Indian River Lagoon. And we continue to be involved in microplastics research. We also happen to be the Titusville, where I live, is the most important horseshoe crab nesting beach in all of Florida.
Hmm.
And so we're involved in monitoring and tracking horseshoe crab populations. They're not as
Yeah.
big as Delaware in those areas, but it's important for Florida. And it's just this one little beach that has just
Huh.
thousands and thousands of horseshoe crabs. So,
You'll see them in North Carolina every now and then,
oh,
but
cool.
they're not very common.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. There, yeah, you get up towards sort of Delaware and those some of those estuaries up in there, and they're important. But also
Uh-huh.
you get a little bit along the coast, like you said, and
Right.
but then the Indian River Lagoon has been really important for it. So we're working on those types of species where there's a lot of effort in the Indian River Lagoon for oyster restoration, for clam restoration, seagrass restoration. So we're trying to cooperate with those groups, and we volunteer, and we have adopted a clam bed off of Titusville that tomorrow I'm going out and helping to clean and monitor. So rather than trying to develop our own restoration work here, where there's so much already going on, we try to get people who wouldn't be involved
Right.
normally, like churches, in some of that work.
Yeah.
We also have had a lot of emphasis on training young scientists. So we've had an internship program where the interns live with us, and we again live in that community and are doing research. And it's part of it is helping them get into conservation professionally. So the one student I mentioned is doing a master's. Another
Mhm.
student just got a job at one of the local conservation centers doing marine education. And so we've been able to help people get into roles because of these internships. And so there is this big focus on uh, particularly people who want to go into careers in conservation.
Sure.
And then I do a lot of work internationally. I mentioned Kenya. I oversee a lot of the marine work there. And we've started a brand new project in Portugal where there's an estuary there. It's where our work started 40 years
Right,
ago.
right. I
And
mean, gave it
it's
the name, right? Yeah.
exactly, and it's focused broadly on conservation. If you look at the southern coast of Portugal, you see just tons of development,
Huh.
except for one area, and it's around the area where we've done our research
Hmm.
and worked to protect it. But most of that work has been on land with birds and things, and so we're beginning to really investigate the marine conservation
That's great.
work there. So yeah, so I'm excited about that. And
Absolutely.
even we're actually developing a new project in India. Most of our work in India has been on tigers and even human elephant
Mhm.
conflict. And so I've got a friend because we lived in India, so we're
Right.
developing a project on sponges, and you don't hear
Hmm.
much about conservation of sponges.
No, you do not.
So it should be really fun to
Huh.
develop. So
Very cool. Well, Bob, we got a couple minutes left. Last question
okay,
for you. If anyone on the call wants to maybe think or get more involved in
yeah.
Rocha, what in what ways can they do that?
Okay, I've got a couple. I'll put it in the chat. One is just personally, we send out a newsletter that talks about the things that we're doing, just my work. If
Right.
anybody wanted to receive that as snail mail, so I still do snail mail. I think people read it then. There's my email address, or if you want a book recommendation or just want to contact me, I'm happy to be contacted. So that's one thing is my personal email address. The other is we do have, like I said, these centers globally. We own the top of a mountain in the south coast of France. There's this center in Canada that's doing river restoration. You can see some of the opportunities if you want to take a holiday for a week and do some conservation work.
Yeah, that
You
work
can
in
see,
Canada sounds really interesting.
yeah, it's really cool. We also, again, this is there's if you are a person, particularly the Christian faith, and you want to join a community of people who are trying to figure this out, how does conservation and faith go together? And then how do we practically, as we say, love your place?
Hmm.
That's a online community that it's free to join, and there's other people maybe in your area who do that. And they do book clubs where they read and discussions. Obviously I have to sort of throw this in here that if if you're interested in donating to our work, there's
Sure.
ways of doing that, including the conservation work in here in Florida. And we are a donations and grant based organization. So that is extremely helpful.
That's great.
And lastly, at the risk of self promotion, there's a bit of I've written sort of this is more of a theological analysis of the sort of science around plastic pollution that would
Uh-huh.
apply to rivers. It's focused on marine plastics,
Uh-huh.
but if you know someone that is might benefit from it, or if you yourself are interested in investigating some of these, what you mentioned, Josh, about this idea of healing relationships,
Yeah.
reconciling in a Christian concept, and that applied to plastic pollution, then that would be something that it's per purchase. It's from a theological college in the UK. It's
Yep.
like $5 or something. It's not much.
That's
So
great,
those
man.
are some basic ways with the finances of volunteering, with joining a community, that you could sort of get to know a little bit more. And just in our general website, to remind you, is this, just to learn more about the things that we're
Great.
doing. So
Well, Bob, thank you so much for taking time out
yeah,
of your day to spend with us.
yeah,
And
very
yeah,
happy to do it.
really appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Great. All right. Thank you all. I really appreciate the
Take
opportunity.
care.
Best
All right.
wishes. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.